Hey everyone, welcome back. The other week, I came across an interesting study by 416 Labs, which is a group of educated professionals and journalists based out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Their study is regarding U.S. news headlines about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and they describe their study as follows. The Israel-Palestine issue is often described as one of the most intractable conflicts in the world. With the occupation now in its 52nd year, a solution remains elusive. A key factor in prolonging the conflict has been the United States' unconditional support for successive Israeli governments, which has helped entrench Israel's illegal presence in the Palestine territories. Augmenting this has been the U.S. mainstream media, which critics argue has maintained a slanted view of the occupation, one that favors the Israeli narrative over those of the Palestinians. And if we scroll down a little bit here, we can see this graph that they've given us here. It shows headlines per year regarding Israel and Palestine in the U.S. And you can see Israel is getting a lot more coverage than Palestine. And I mean, it makes sense because there's a lot of Jewish journalists in the U.S. That's just the way it is, I suppose. But if you were going to argue that you're giving equal coverage, then there would not be this much of a difference. You can see with Palestine, they peaked like under 1,000 per year. And when it comes to Israel, they've peaked at around 3,250 by the looks of it. But either way, coverage of both has been going down in recent years. If we scroll down a little bit further, we can see table 2 here. They have the top 30 unigrams and bigrams for Israel and Palestine-centric headlines. And a unigram just means a one word that relates to the topic. The bigram, like it suggests, 2 words, Middle East. And these are all the top unigrams and bigrams. Now, if we pop open the PDF of the study, it's found on the 416 Labs website, and I've included a link to that study in the description below. We can see they have the objective stated here, and the objective is as follows. While the existing academic literature on the American media coverage of Israel-Palestine has identified a persistent pro-Israel bias, as we all knew, this appears to be based on a relatively limited corpus. And what they mean by that is just what was covered before was based on a smaller sample of the related materials than this study was. On this study, they proclaim they have the largest corpus of information. Few, according to our knowledge, have investigated an extended time frame. In this study, we investigate the U.S. media coverage of the Israel-Palestine issue over the 50-year period of Israel's occupation from June 1967 to June 2017 across 5 major American newspapers. And scrolling down a little further describes the methodology used. Our approach involved the use of natural language processing, NLP, techniques such as sentiment analysis, which would be positive or negative sentiments towards the coverage, and engrams, as we talked about earlier, 1 word or 2 words relating to the conflict. To investigate the vocabulary used in the chosen newspaper headlines in terms of both general sentiment and the terms/topics most closely associated with both groups, engrams were used in 3 different contexts. Overall aggregate basis across the papers, which is the total of all of it. And they also organized by publication and by decade. Now let's take a look at some of the key findings. Now, sentiment analysis was probably the least dramatic finding in the study, however, still statistically significant. While overall headlines in both corpuses were largely negative, Israeli-centric headlines were more positive than Palestinian-centric ones. Israeli headlines were statistically more significantly positive than Palestinian ones for all publications except for the Washington Post. 44% of Israeli headlines were negative compared to 48% of Palestinian headlines. Now, you could argue that if it was a lot of Palestinians in American news, that it could easily be the other way around. However, Palestinians didn't choose to organize themselves that way. So you have to keep that in mind. And for the last point, in each of the selected 5 newspapers, regardless of political orientation, proportionately more Palestinian-centric headlines were negative than Israeli ones, and less positive except for the Washington Post. Now, if we take a glance at some of the other key findings, we will see that since 1967, use of the word occupation has declined by 85% in the Israeli dataset of headlines and 65% in the Palestinian dataset. Since 1967, mentions of Palestinian refugees have declined by an overall 93%. Israeli sources are nearly 250% more likely to be quoted as Palestinians. The number of headlines centering Israel were published 4 times more than those centering Palestine. Words connoting violence, such as terror, appear 3 times as much as the word occupation in the Palestinian dataset. Explicit recognition that Israeli settlements and settlers are illegal rarely appears in both datasets. Since 1967, mentions of East Jerusalem, distinguishing that part of the city occupied by Israel in 1967 from the rest of the city, appeared only a total of 132 times. The Los Angeles Times has portrayed Palestinians most negatively, followed by the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, and lastly, the New York Times. Coverage of the conflict has reduced dramatically in the second half of the 50-year period. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed the research and the analysis, please hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the future.